Let's move on to something else, because politicians have been raising awareness of mental health issues in recent years. But what's provision like for people suffering with a mental illness? Have a look at this.
My name is Anneli Roberts and I run a website called pigletish.com.
Hi, I'm Anneli and this is Pigletish. Hi, it's Anneli and welcome to my channel,
where I host a podcast and blog on mental health awareness and signpost to resources that people can turn to for help.
I'll link it on my feet.
I started to write about my mental health journey after being diagnosed with PTSD. The process that happened for me was that I went to see my GP and explained to her about the audio hallucinations I was having and the problems sleeping and the night terrors that I was having. And she told me that it was post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was my initial GP appointment just over 2 years ago now. She was saying, well, none of the services we offer are appropriate for this, and that I should self-refer to a charity. And she said to me, they probably will have a significant waiting list, but you should self-refer to that charity. And then after that, I decided to move nearer my family and friends. I realised that whatever I did, it was going to be a significant wait until I got help, and I needed to make sure I was around people that loved me in the meantime. When I arrived in Cardiff, when I first moved here, I decided that I was going to, in fact, initially I didn't reach out for help. I waited a couple of weeks and then I found the energy again to ask for help. I contacted a charity called Rise, who put me in touch with Women's Aid, and I got an email back from them saying that the waiting list was 8 to 12 months and that they'd post me out some forms to fill in and that I would then be on their waiting list. I have found the most incredible community of people online who provide so much support to each other. At the minute I've got almost 7,000 followers, and the overwhelming response is just positivity. I get messages every single day from people saying how much I've helped them. I also send messages out every single day saying how much people have helped me. Mostly share mental health related content, although I do talk about my dog a little bit.
Isabel, what's your reaction to Anneli Roberts' story there?
Well, I actually have the same illness as her, and my heart goes out to her because it is a horrendous illness and it sort of robs you of so many things, work and relationships and sanity for a lot of time. And I also have the same experience as she does in terms of accessing therapy, in that when I first went to my GP, having had a mental breakdown at the Conservative Party conference, which was not the cause of my PTSD, I should add, but the GP basically said, do you have savings? And I said, yes, I do. And she said, well, in that case, it's either wait a year for treatment on the NHS or start paying for it yourself. And I did that until my savings ran out, and then a charity that helps journalists paid for my therapy, which I'm still having now. And some of the therapy for PTSD is incredibly expensive to access. So I was having sessions that at one point were £150 an hour to have, and I mean, it was horrible because I was paying that much to basically cry for an hour in a room. But I had money. Well, I did have money until I spent it all on therapy. But most people don't have savings that they can access when they're off sick and not earning any money. And we just wouldn't accept this for physical health. And it's very difficult to make comparisons between mental health and physical health, because if you have a broken leg, it can heal. Actually, I'm not sure if I'll ever quite sort of heal up the black hole that I've got as a result of PTSD inside me. I'm just learning to walk around it better. But you just would not accept this for a broken leg. You wouldn't be left with your bones broken for an entire year. And actually, you don't stay static as someone with a mental illness when you're not receiving therapy. You get worse. And then you actually end up, as I have done in the past, needing hospital admission, which costs a great deal more than the talking therapies which people should be able to access when their illness is less acute.
Are we dealing with people suffering from mental health well enough?
Clearly not. And I think what Isabel said and what she's written over the past year or so is incredibly important, because it brings to the front line this debate. And I mean, I talk about this a huge amount on my radio show, and the stories I hear from people who call in, very similar to yours. And there will be people watching this programme now who say, well, how can she have mental health when she's on television? But it
I'm always
doesn't...
glad when I make it onto television.
Yeah, but it doesn't work like that. We know that. And I mean, the government have said they're putting a huge amount more into mental health. Well, they absolutely need to do that. But whatever it is at the moment, and I'll steal Pfizer's line here, because it won't be enough. And you can't just take money out of other health budgets. It does actually need extra money. And to govern is to choose, and you have to make choices about how you spend money. But it's quite clear that more money needs to be spent on mental health.
Tom, give us some of the figures, because Theresa May has talked a lot about this, and talking about it, no doubt, is half or some of the problem. But is there any point in raising awareness if it isn't then matched by a commitment, at least, to provide the resources?
So sadly, the figures bear out the stories. And so actually about 2/3 of people with a physical health condition will get the treatment that they need. So actually there's already a fairly large number of people with physical health conditions that don't get treatment that they need. But it's just 25% of people with anxiety and depression who can access talking therapies like you heard about in the package. I think if you then look at what the government's plans are, it's quite striking. Under their plans, even if the targets are met, 75% of adults won't get treatment, and 2/3 of children and young people won't get treatment. And that's if the targets are hit. So the plans that they currently have to increase investment in mental health don't go nearly far enough. The recent announcement of an extra $2 billion is proportionately the same amount as the overall funding increase, and it clearly isn't enough. I mean, if you look at the NHS budget overall, we know that mental health accounts for 23% of the total disease burden, but just 11% of NHS spending, and the government doesn't have a plan to change that.
What should Labour commit to do? Because there are figures, not enough, as we've heard from guests here. The government, back in 2013, though, this was, pledged £1.25 billion for child and adolescent mental health, £1 billion invested into a national strategy of adult mental health, and yet we still hear stories like Isabel's, like Anneli's, and also of people being held in police cells overnight who are mentally ill because there just isn't the provision there.
There is a real crisis here, and we hear it from whether it's adults, whether it's young people. My best friend is a therapist, a youth therapist. Her centre in the last 2 years has almost been closed down twice. And this is dealing with teenagers going through really hard times.
What would you like to see Labour commit to?
For Labour, there's a few things. Obviously, the issue of money is the big one. Now, this government has talked a big game. The truth is that they've done a classic thing they've done in lots of other areas. They took with two hands back in 2010, 2011, and then they've given back with one more recently. And they'd like us to forget that it's still lower now than it was then.
So would you like to see parity in terms of parity of esteem the Prime Minister talked about? What sort of parity would you like to see financially then going into mental health?
Look, we need to take this far more seriously. I can't say what specific that sum is, but we certainly need to be, I mean, maybe Tom knows that better than me, but what I would say is that more generally in society, we've got to a point where people are getting more mentally ill. And that's not just about awareness, that's about stress. All of the other things in society that are leading to people having a harder time. And it's just been more tougher on people's mental health.
So Pfizer's absolutely right that there's a huge growth in demand, and that's coming from two places. More precariousness in work, so people having a poor experience of work, and that's increasing stress in their lives. And the other area is for children and young people, where there has been an explosion of mental ill health. At IPPR, we looked at the numbers.
Predominantly by this.
That may be the case, but we looked at IPPR at what would it take to go from parity of esteem, which is saying nice words, to parity of service. So if mental health, the availability of mental health treatments was similar to that for physical health treatments, that would require another 4.1 billion by 2023-24 in investment. So far, the government has
on
indicated...
top of the 20 billion?
It depends on whether you would see it as substituting, but in total on today's spending, the government's commitment so far has been to increase spending by just 2 billion. So it's not even half the way there to achieving parity of service. So it's a long way to go.
Isabel.
I never thought I'd say this, particularly given they're threatening to cancel Christmas, but I think the Lib Dems deserve a little bit of credit for this, actually, because back in, I think it was 2014,
they were the
Nick
ones.
Clegg decided to make mental health a real priority. And I remember us grumpy journalists being briefed on his speech where he wanted to say, I want mental health to be the sort of thing you can talk about at the school gate. And some of my journalistic colleagues were going, that's just not going to happen. And they weren't being particularly hard-bitten. They just couldn't see in the current context that was possible. Now, I don't think I'm particularly outspoken about my mental health. I just think society has changed even since then, to the extent that you can say to someone, I've got mental health problems, and they're not going to run a mile anymore.
All right.